4 days after my wife, Elise Holloway, died in what police called a tragic mountain crash, I was standing alone in our bedroom, trying to find the navy dress she wanted buried in. Instead, I knocked over an old storage box, and something hit the hardwood floor with a sound that didn't belong there. Wrapped inside one of her winter scarves was a smartphone I'd never seen before. My hands started shaking before I even picked it up, because after 34 years of marriage, I knew every phone she'd ever owned, or at least I thought I did. The screen lit up the moment I pressed the power button. It wasn't dead. It wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. Before I could even wonder why my wife had hidden it from me, a new message appeared across the lock screen. It had been sent less than a minute earlier. I can still remember every word because they changed everything I believed about the woman I loved. Did he find the phone yet? Or do we still have time? In that moment, I stopped wondering how my wife died and started wondering who expected me to find what she'd left behind. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you never imagined they could keep a secret from you, let me know by subscribing. And if this story keeps making you question what you would do in my place, stay with me, because that hidden phone was only the beginning of a truth I never saw coming. People think the hardest part of losing your wife is the funeral. They're wrong. It's walking through a house where everything still expects her to come back. Her reading glasses were still resting beside the couch. Her favorite coffee mug was drying on the kitchen rack exactly where she'd left it. Even the old golden retriever kept sitting by the front door every evening, waiting for footsteps that were never coming home. Somehow, that silence hurt more than the accident itself. My name is Garrett Holloway. I'm 61 years old, and for nearly 3 decades I worked as a railroad safety inspector across Central Oregon. My job taught me that every accident leaves behind a reason, even when people call it bad luck. I spent most of my career looking for the tiny detail everyone else overlooked. Funny enough, I never imagined the biggest mystery of my life would begin inside my own home after the woman I loved was already gone. Elise and I weren't the loud, romantic couple people post about online. We built our marriage through ordinary days that slowly became extraordinary because we shared them together. Every Friday evening, we'd order takeout from the same little Italian restaurant near the Old Mill District. Every Sunday morning, she'd drag me to the farmer's market, even though I always complained about waking up early. Looking back now, those little routines feel far more valuable than all the expensive vacations we ever took. She restored damaged paintings for museums and private collectors. I never fully understood how someone could spend 6 hours repairing a tiny crack in a 200-year-old canvas, but she loved bringing forgotten things back to life. Sometimes she'd come home with flecks of paint on her hands and laugh when I pointed them out. She'd say, "Every scar tells part of the story, Garrett. You don't erase history, you respect it." I never realized those words would one day describe her more than any painting she ever touched. Our daughter, Avery Holloway, inherited Elise's patience. She worked as a pediatric occupational therapist in Portland and somehow convinced frightened children to smile on their worst days. Our son, Connor Holloway, became a structural engineer in Seattle, always believing every problem had a logical solution if you looked hard enough. Watching them build their own lives made retirement seem less frightening because Elise and I finally had time to imagine what came next. We talked about buying a small cabin near the Cascade Lakes, fishing in the mornings, and arguing over whose turn it was to cook dinner. Nothing about our life suggested secrets. We never fought over money because the house had been paid off years earlier. Neither of us checked the other's phone. We didn't need passwords to prove trust. If Elise stayed late restoring a painting, I believed her. If I spent 12 hours inspecting damaged rail lines after a storm, she never questioned where I'd been. After 34 years together, trust wasn't something we talked about anymore. It simply existed, like breathing. But when grief forces you to replay thousands of ordinary memories, tiny moments begin refusing to stay ordinary. I remembered Elise stepping outside to answer 2 phone calls during the last month before the crash. I remembered her changing the subject when I asked why she suddenly wanted to reorganize the bedroom closet by herself. I remembered waking up one night and finding her side of the bed empty, only to discover her sitting quietly on the back porch, staring into the darkness with a blanket around her shoulders. When I asked if she was all right, she smiled, just enough to make me stop asking. At the time, none of those moments felt important. They felt like the small mysteries every long marriage quietly collects over the years. I never imagined they were pieces of something much larger. Standing there with that hidden phone still resting in my hands, I realized the accident hadn't just taken my wife from me. It had left me alone with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered, and one unread message that somehow already knew I had found exactly what Elise never wanted anyone else to see. What a malign link. I carried the phone into my home office and locked the door without really thinking about it. It wasn't because I believed someone was watching me. It was because, for the first time since Elise died, I felt like I was holding something that didn't belong to the grieving husband everyone expected me to be. The phone was strangely clean, almost untouched, with no cracked screen or scratches around the edges. Whoever hid it hadn't tossed it into that closet in a hurry. They'd chosen that exact spot, carefully, as if they knew one day I'd be the one standing there. The lock screen showed 6 numbers instead of a fingerprint request. I stared at it for nearly a minute before my hands moved on their own. I typed Elise's birthday. Nothing. Then our wedding anniversary. Wrong again. I almost set the phone down when another date slipped into my mind. The birthday of our daughter, Avery Holloway. The screen unlocked instantly. My stomach tightened. Elise had always said Avery was the greatest thing that had ever happened to us. Somehow, that choice made perfect sense, and somehow it made the phone feel even more personal. At first, nothing looked unusual. There were no family pictures, no social media apps, no saved contacts with familiar names. The wallpaper was nothing but a gray mountain landscape I'd never seen before. It felt less like someone's personal phone and more like a tool built for one purpose. Then I noticed several folders labeled with ordinary names like notes, recipes, and invoices. When I opened them, every single folder was empty. It was almost too empty, as if someone had carefully cleaned the entire device while hoping one small piece would survive. Years of accident investigations had trained me to stop looking where everyone else looked. I opened the settings instead. The storage bar caught my attention immediately. Nearly 70 gigabytes were already being used, yet the phone appeared almost blank. Files don't simply disappear without leaving fingerprints. Someone had deleted them, or hidden them. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. That's what always happened when I knew I was standing at the edge of something important. Then another notification appeared across the top of the screen before fading away almost instantly. It wasn't a text message this time. It came from an encrypted messaging app I'd never heard of. By the time I opened it, the alert had vanished, but one line had burned itself into my memory. No mistakes this time. There was no name attached, no profile picture. Just those 4 words. They weren't emotional. They weren't comforting. They sounded like instructions from someone who believed a plan was still unfolding even after Elise's death. I searched through the recent calls, hoping to find a number I recognized, but every entry had already been erased. The calendar looked empty too, until I switched to archived events. Suddenly dozens of appointments appeared under meaningless titles like Canvas Delivery, North Account, and Blue Inventory. None of them matched Elise's museum work. What unsettled me most wasn't that she'd hidden meetings from me. It was that almost every appointment had taken place during normal work hours, on days when she'd kissed me goodbye and told me she was heading to restore another painting. I leaned back in my chair, trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she had been helping someone. Maybe she was planning a surprise. Maybe grief was twisting ordinary things into impossible suspicions. But before I could finish that thought, The encrypted app refreshed by itself. One unread conversation appeared where nothing had existed seconds earlier. The sender's name wasn't saved. Only a single gray circle with the letter def. I opened the thread, and the very first message erased every explanation I'd been desperately trying to believe. The message from the contact, marked only with the letter D, stayed on my mind for the rest of the night. I must have read those few surviving words 50 times, hoping they'd suddenly make sense. Instead, they only made the silence inside my house feel heavier. If Elise had been living a second life behind my back, none of this fit. If she'd been protecting me, I couldn't understand why she'd chosen to die with those answers instead of trusting her own husband. By sunrise, I stopped asking whether the hidden phone had changed my marriage. The real question had become whether I had ever understood the danger she was carrying alone. The morning of the funeral passed like someone else's memory. I shook hands, accepted hugs, and thanked people whose faces I barely recognized. Everyone spoke about Elise's kindness, her patience, and the beautiful paintings she'd brought back to life. Then an elderly woman I didn't know stepped quietly beside me after the service. She introduced herself as Judith Kerrigan, a retired library archivist. Before walking away, she slipped a folded business card into my hand and whispered, "Elise told me if anything unexpected ever happened to her, you would eventually know where to look." Before I could ask another question, Judith disappeared into the crowd. I waited until I reached my truck before unfolding the card. There was no message, no handwriting, just the embossed logo of a storage facility nearly 40 minutes outside Bend. At first I thought she'd handed me the wrong card. Then I remembered one of the archived calendar entries on the hidden phone, North account, scheduled on the same day every month. The storage facility sat on North Highway 97. It couldn't be a coincidence anymore. The manager searched the records after I gave him Elise's name, but nothing appeared. I thanked him and turned toward the exit, convinced I'd reached another dead end. Then he stopped me. "Hold on," he said. "Try Caldwell." My heart skipped. Maren Caldwell was Elise's younger sister. The locker wasn't rented under Elise's name at all. It had been leased under Maren's, but the monthly payments had been made using an account that belonged to Elise. Maren had never mentioned any storage unit. She hadn't even hinted one existed. Inside, the unit looked almost empty. There were no boxes of family keepsakes or old furniture. Only a steel filing cabinet, a folding table, and several flat shipping crates used to transport artwork. Every crate carried the logo of museums Elise had genuinely worked with, but tucked beneath the bottom crate was something completely different, a locked metal cash box. I found the tiny key taped beneath the table exactly where only someone familiar with the room would think to hide it. Inside were dozens of receipts, several flash drives, and a notebook written entirely in Elise's handwriting. The notebook wasn't a diary, it was a record. Every page listed dates, locations, payment amounts, and initials instead of names. Beside many entries, Elise had written short observations like, "Photographed, copied, keep original." None of it resembled museum work. It looked more like someone quietly documenting a pattern they expected would matter someday. One set of initials appeared more than any other, DR. I didn't know who those letters belonged to yet, but seeing them repeated over and over made the single letter on the encrypted messages suddenly feel far less random. I took photographs of every page before putting everything back exactly as I'd found it. Years of investigating rail accidents had taught me never to disturb evidence unless absolutely necessary. As I locked the storage unit, my phone rang. It was my daughter, Avery Holloway. She asked where I was because several relatives were worried I had disappeared after the funeral luncheon. I lied for the first time in my marriage without even hesitating. I told her I was driving through the mountains because I needed time alone. The words tasted awful, but something inside me kept insisting that until I understood what Elise had uncovered, the fewer people who knew, the safer they would be. That evening, I met Nolan Pierce again. He studied the notebook for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. Finally, he stopped on one particular page where Elise had circled a date just 2 weeks before the crash. Nolan compared it with public records on his laptop, then slowly turned the screen toward me. The circled date matched the creation of a charitable land acquisition handled by a private foundation I'd never heard of. The executive director's signature appeared on every document. His name was Brecht Declan Rhodes. Neither of us recognized the organization, but one thing became painfully clear. Elise hadn't been secretly meeting another man. She'd been secretly tracking one. Before we could discuss what to do next, the hidden phone vibrated across the table. Neither of us had touched it. Another encrypted message had just arrived from the same contact, marked only with the letter D. This time it contained no greeting, only one sentence. The storage unit has been compromised. Find it before he does. Nolan and I looked at each other in complete silence. We had told no one about the storage unit. No one. Neither of us moved for several seconds after the message appeared. Nolan finally reached over and switched the hidden phone into airplane mode before anyone else could contact it. The room fell silent again, but the damage had already been done. Someone knew about the storage unit within minutes of us leaving it. That wasn't a coincidence. It meant one of two things. Either Elise had anticipated this exact moment and arranged those messages in advance, or someone was actively watching for that phone to come back online. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. The next morning, Nolan introduced me to Owen Mercer, a certified mobile device forensic specialist in Eugene, who occasionally worked with federal investigators. I expected him to spend hours trying to unlock complicated software. Instead, he barely looked at the messages. He was interested in something else entirely. Deleted files almost never disappear, he said while connecting the phone to specialized equipment. People erase what they think is dangerous. They forget the phone remembers far more than they do. For the first time since Elise died, I felt like someone was finally asking the right questions. The recovery process took nearly 3 hours. Owen remained unusually quiet, occasionally writing notes but never explaining what he had found. Then he stopped typing altogether. He stared at the screen, removed his glasses, and looked directly at me. "Mr. Holloway," he said carefully, "I think you've been investigating the wrong story." My chest tightened. I had spent days preparing myself to discover another man, another family, another betrayal. Instead, Owen slowly turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a folder titled, "If Garrett Ever Finds This." I couldn't bring myself to open it. My hand hovered over the mouse while every terrible possibility raced through my mind. Nolan finally placed a hand on my shoulder and quietly nodded. I clicked. The first file wasn't a photograph, it was a video. Elise appeared sitting alone inside her restoration studio. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She stared directly into the camera for several seconds before speaking. "Garrett, if you're watching this, then something went wrong." My heart stopped. She wasn't speaking to the police. She wasn't speaking to investigators. She was speaking only to me. She apologized, not for loving someone else, not for lying about our marriage, but for carrying a burden she believed I could never safely share. She explained that nearly a year earlier, while restoring historical artwork for a private charitable foundation, she had accidentally discovered financial records hidden inside shipment documents. At first she thought they were accounting mistakes. Then she realized they were evidence of millions of dollars quietly disappearing through fake restoration projects that never existed. She admitted she had copied everything before anyone realized she'd seen it. The notebook, the flash drives, the hidden phone, they had all been created for one purpose. She wasn't collecting memories. She was collecting proof. Then she said something that completely shattered every assumption I'd made since finding the phone. "I never told you, because the safest version of you was the one who knew absolutely nothing." I covered my face with both hands. Every suspicious late night, Every secret phone call, every unexplained meeting. None of them had been acts of betrayal. They had been acts of protection. Elise had allowed me to believe our life was ordinary, because the moment I understood what she was doing, I would have become part of it. For 34 years, she'd trusted me with everything. The one secret she kept was the one she believed might save my life. Owen recovered another file, an audio recording created less than 6 hours before the crash. This time, Elise's voice sounded different, shorter breaths, a quieter tone. She whispered instead of spoke, "If anything happens to me, it won't be because of the paintings." There was a pause. Declan finally knows someone copied the records. Another pause. He still doesn't know it was me. Then, just before the recording ended, another sound slipped into the silence, the car door closing. Footsteps on gravel, and a man's voice somewhere in the distance, not close enough to understand the words. Close enough to know she wasn't alone. The recording ended abruptly. Nobody in the room spoke. Owen slowly removed his headphones before breaking the silence. "The official report says your wife's SUV left the road because she lost control on a wet curve." He looked at the waveform still frozen on his monitor. "But this recording was made only hours before that crash, and your wife doesn't sound like someone driving home from work." He paused. "She sounds like someone who already knew she was being followed." I drove back to Bend with Elise's voice playing over and over inside my head. Until that morning, I'd been trying to prove whether my wife had betrayed our marriage. By the time I pulled into my driveway, that question no longer existed. The woman I'd buried wasn't living a secret romance. She had been quietly carrying a burden that would have broken most people. For the first time since the crash, my grief changed into something else. I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was protecting the truth she had died trying to preserve. The first thing I did was move every flash drive, notebook, and recovered file out of the house. If someone had known about the storage unit, there was no reason to believe my home was still safe. I rented a secure safety deposit box in Salem under my own name and left only copies behind. Years spent investigating railroad accidents had taught me one simple lesson. Evidence only matters if it survives long enough to be seen. Whoever had been chasing Elise had already failed once. I wasn't going to hand them a second chance. That afternoon, I finally met Detective Rhea Donovan from the Major Crash Investigation Unit. She had quietly requested Elise's case after Nolan pointed out the missing section in the original accident report. At first she listened without interrupting, while I explained the hidden phone, the storage unit, the notebook, and the recovered recordings. She didn't make promises or dramatic speeches. Instead, she opened Elise's official crash file, compared it with the recovered timeline, and frowned almost immediately. Someone had requested access to the evidence locker less than 12 hours after the accident. The request had been approved, but there was no record showing who actually collected the material. Rhea obtained a court order that same afternoon to review traffic cameras along the final route Elise had driven before the crash. Most of the footage had already been overwritten, but one camera outside a fuel station captured something important. Elise's SUV wasn't alone. Less than 300 yards behind her was a black luxury sedan that remained the exact same distance for nearly 18 miles. It never attempted to pass. It never turned onto another road. It simply stayed behind her until both vehicles disappeared toward Santiam Pass. The sedan's license plate couldn't be read, but one detail stood out. A silver emblem shaped like a falcon decorated the front grille. Rhea enlarged the image and leaned closer to the monitor. She didn't recognize the emblem, but I did. Less than a week earlier, while flipping through the notebook inside the storage unit, I'd noticed a business card clipped between 2 pages. The same silver falcon had been embossed in one corner above the name Rhodes Heritage Foundation. Until that moment, the foundation had felt like a collection of suspicious paperwork. Now it had become something much more dangerous. For the first time, there was evidence placing someone connected to Declan Rhodes near Elise shortly before she died. We weren't the only ones beginning to connect the pieces. That evening, Ria received confirmation that someone had entered the Foundation's headquarters after business hours and removed dozens of financial records from the archives. Security footage showed employees carrying sealed boxes directly to an industrial shredding service. They weren't organizing paperwork. They were destroying it. Whatever Declan believed we had discovered, he was moving faster than before. Then came the first real mistake he couldn't erase. One of the recovered flash drives contained a spreadsheet that Elise had secretly copied months earlier. Every payment matched the notebook perfectly, except for one transaction. Instead of initials, a complete signature appeared at the bottom of the page. Quob sublimentem. It was the first document placing his name directly inside the financial trail Elise had been documenting for almost a year. Ria quietly closed the file before looking at me across the table. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "this stopped being only a fatal crash investigation the moment your wife recorded those files." I nodded slowly. "No," I answered. "It stopped being just an accident the day Elise realized someone powerful was willing to kill to keep those records hidden." At that exact moment, Ria's office phone rang. She answered, listened for only a few seconds, then her expression changed completely. Without saying a word, she placed the receiver down and looked straight at me. "My officers just arrived at your house." I felt my stomach drop. "They're too late. Someone had already broken in. Nothing valuable had been taken, except the empty box where Elise's hidden phone had originally been kept. Lemsel burglary changed everything. Until that night, I believed I was a few steps behind the people who wanted Elise's secrets. Standing in my living room with shattered glass covering the floor, I realized they were only a few steps behind me. Every drawer had been emptied. Every closet stood open. The bedroom looked as though someone had searched it with purpose instead of anger. Yet my television, my laptop, my wallet, even the cash inside the kitchen drawer were untouched. Whoever broke into my house hadn't come to steal. They had come to recover something they believed I still had. Detective Ria Donovan arrived less than 20 minutes later with a forensic team. They photographed footprints, collected fingerprints, and dusted every surface that had been disturbed. One of the technicians quietly pulled Ria aside after examining the back door. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever entered my house hadn't kicked the door open or smashed a window. They unlocked it. That meant someone either had a key or knew exactly how to get inside without leaving obvious damage. I suddenly remembered something Elise had said years earlier after we replaced the locks. Never hide a spare key somewhere predictable. Back then, she'd laughed while saying it. Now I wondered if she'd been speaking from experience. Avery and Connor arrived before midnight. The moment Avery stepped into the house, she burst into tears. Connor didn't say a word. He simply walked from room to room, taking in the destruction before stopping beside me in the kitchen. "Dad," his voice barely rose above a whisper. "This has to stop." For the first time since Elise died, both of my children knew the truth, or at least enough of it to understand why someone had broken into our home. I explained the hidden phone, the recordings, the Foundation, and Declan Rhodes. Neither of them interrupted. They simply listened. When I finished, Connor leaned both hands against the counter. "If these people killed Mom," he struggled to finish the sentence, "then they'll come back for you." Avery grabbed my hand so tightly it almost hurt. "Dad, please. I already lost Mom. I can't lose you too." Those words hit harder than anything I'd heard since the funeral. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The house felt smaller than it ever had before. Not because of the damage, because fear had finally moved in. That night I didn't sleep. Every sound outside made me reach for the light. Every passing car slowed my heartbeat. Around 3 in the morning, I walked into the garage looking for an old flashlight. Instead, I found something I'd completely forgotten existed. Hidden behind a shelf of paint cans sat the last box Elise had packed before our planned retirement. Across the top, in her handwriting, were 3 simple words: "Open if necessary." I couldn't remember ever seeing it before. Inside were old travel journals, museum brochures, several family photographs, and a small brown envelope sealed with blue wax. My name was written across the front, only my name. The letter inside contained just 2 handwritten sentences. If you're reading this, then they've already started looking where I hoped they never would. The last truth isn't on the phone, Garrett. It's where we first believed our future would begin. My hands began shaking again. Where we first believed our future would begin. Then I remembered, almost a year earlier, Elise and I had placed a deposit on a small lakeside cabin near the Cascade Lakes. We eventually decided not to buy it after repairs became too expensive. Except, Elise had insisted on keeping one key. At the time, I thought it was sentiment. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked up at Rhea. She already knew what I was thinking. If she left something there, she said quietly, whoever's chasing you probably doesn't know it exists. I reached into the envelope one last time. A tiny brass key slid into my palm. Attached to it was a faded wooden tag. Cabin 14. No address, no explanation, just enough hope to remind me that Elise's final secret still hadn't been found. At sunrise, Detective Rhea Donovan insisted we travel separately. If someone was watching my house, the last thing we wanted was to lead them directly to cabin 14. I drove north first, then doubled back through 2 different county roads before finally turning toward the Cascade Lakes. The farther I drove, the quieter everything became. Pine trees swallowed the highway, the cell signal faded, and for the first time in days, I realized I hadn't spoken a single word during the entire drive. I kept hearing Elise's voice in my head repeating the same sentence. The last truth isn't on the phone. Whatever waited inside that cabin had been important enough for her to protect until the very end. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, except older. The paint had faded, weeds had pushed through the gravel driveway, and a heavy layer of dust covered the front porch. No one had lived there for months. The brass key slid smoothly into the lock. Elise had been right, nobody had changed it. As the door creaked open, I expected another hidden room, another locked box, another impossible secret. Instead, everything inside looked painfully ordinary. A worn sofa, an unfinished fireplace, empty kitchen shelves. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed the letter had sent us to the wrong place. Rhea began searching room by room, while I stood in the living area trying to remember why Elise had loved this place so much. Then my eyes settled on the fireplace. Months before we canceled the purchase, Elise had joked that the stonework looked uneven because one mason must have been taller than the other. I walked closer. She'd been right. One stone near the bottom didn't line up with the rest. I pressed against it gently. It shifted almost an inch. Hidden behind it was a narrow steel container sealed inside the wall. Inside the container were only 3 things. A handwritten affidavit signed by Elise, an encrypted USB drive, and a sealed envelope addressed to the Oregon Attorney General. Rhea carefully unfolded the affidavit while I connected the USB drive to my laptop. Neither of us spoke. We both understood that whatever Elise had hidden here wasn't meant for family. It was meant for a courtroom. The drive contained thousands of scanned contracts, bank transfers, internal emails, property records, and audio recordings spanning almost 2 years. Every file connected back to the Rhodes Heritage Foundation, every missing dollar, every fake restoration project, every shell company. Elise hadn't collected fragments of evidence. She had quietly built an entire criminal case. Before we could finish reviewing the files, Rhea's phone vibrated. It was one of her investigators monitoring the foundation. The moment search warrants had been quietly approved that morning, someone inside the organization tried to leave the state using a private aircraft. The passenger list included only one executive, Declan Rhodes. Rhea looked at me, then at the evidence spread across the cabin table. "He knows," she said. "He knows someone finally has everything." She immediately called the district attorney, while another detective contacted federal financial investigators. Within minutes, Emergency warrants expanded from fraud to obstruction of justice and suspected homicide conspiracy. Every agency that had been waiting for solid evidence finally had it. Declan no longer had time to destroy documents, influence witnesses, or disappear quietly. The case Elise had spent a year risking her life to build was finally moving exactly where she'd always intended. As we packed the evidence into secured containers, I noticed one last folded page lying beneath the affidavit. It wasn't addressed to investigators, it was addressed to me. The final line read, "Don't hate yourself for not seeing what I was hiding, Garrett. The only reason I was able to protect the truth was because I never had to pretend around you. Loving you was the only honest part of my double life." I closed my eyes for a moment before carefully folding the letter. For the first time since the crash, I wasn't carrying unanswered questions anymore. I was carrying the proof that would finally let Elise speak for herself. 3 days later, the Marion County Courthouse was surrounded by reporters before sunrise. None of them knew exactly what was about to happen. The investigation had been kept unusually quiet, and the only public announcement mentioned an emergency hearing involving financial fraud. No one outside our small circle knew that Elise's evidence had transformed an ordinary fraud case into something far darker. As I walked through the courthouse doors with Detective Rhea Donovan and Attorney Victor Langford beside me, I wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. I was thinking about the woman who should have been walking beside me instead. Declan Rhodes entered the courtroom, wearing the same calm confidence he'd carried his entire career. He greeted attorneys by name, nodded politely toward the judge, and smiled at reporters as though this were another business inconvenience that expensive lawyers would quickly erase. Then his eyes found me across the room. For just a second, his expression changed. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. He finally understood exactly who I was. Not the grieving husband he'd underestimated, but the man holding everything Elise had died to protect. The prosecution began quietly, building the story one piece at a time. Financial records established the foundation's fake restoration projects. Bank transfers revealed millions of dollars moving through shell companies that existed only on paper. Witnesses confirmed artwork had been listed for restoration despite never leaving museum storage. Former employees admitted they had been ordered to sign documents they were never allowed to read. One by one, the polished image Declan had spent years creating began cracking under the weight of facts instead of accusations. Then Victor Langford requested permission to introduce new evidence recovered after Elise Holloway's death. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. The judge approved the request, and the lights dimmed. Elise's recorded message filled the room. "If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't finish what I started." No one moved. No one interrupted. Her calm voice explained exactly how she'd uncovered the fraud, why she secretly documented every transaction, and why she believed someone inside the foundation would eventually silence her if they realized what she'd found. She never accused anyone by emotion. She simply presented facts, dates, names, and evidence with the same careful precision she used when restoring priceless paintings. When the recording ended, the silence inside the courtroom felt almost unbearable. The final blow came from the forensic reconstruction of the crash itself. Investigators demonstrated that Elise's SUV hadn't simply lost control on a wet mountain curve. Tire mark analysis, recovered vehicle data, and newly examined impact evidence proved another vehicle had forced repeated contact with her SUV moments before it left the roadway. Combined with the recovered audio recording and the timeline created from the hidden phone, the conclusion became impossible to ignore. Elise hadn't died because of bad weather. Someone had deliberately made sure she never reached home. For the first time since proceedings began, Declan Rhodes spoke without consulting his attorneys. "This is circumstantial," he snapped. "You can't prove I ordered any of it." Rhea Donovan calmly stood and placed one final document before the judge. It wasn't another financial record. It was an internal authorization signed electronically, less than 2 hours after Elise's crash, directing senior staff to retrieve all remaining materials before her husband becomes aware. The authorization carried Declan Rhodes' verified digital signature. His own silence lasted longer than any answer he could have given. The judge looked slowly across the courtroom before ordering the document entered into evidence. Federal investigators moved immediately. 2 agents approached Declan from opposite sides as his attorneys hurriedly tried to object. Nobody listened. The man who had spent years controlling every conversation suddenly found himself with nothing left to say. As officers escorted him toward the courtroom doors, Declan turned once to look at me. I expected anger, I expected hatred. Instead, I saw something much smaller, regret. Not for what he'd done. For believing Elise Holloway would die before making sure the truth survived her. I thought I'd feel victorious watching Declan Rhodes leave that courtroom in handcuffs. Instead, I felt tired. 34 years with Elise had taught me that real justice isn't loud. It doesn't erase pain, and it doesn't give you back the person you lost. As reporters rushed outside chasing breaking headlines, I remained seated until the courtroom had almost emptied. On the witness table, the judge had left one of Elise's handwritten notes inside a clear evidence sleeve. I stared at her familiar handwriting for several moments before quietly asking if I could have it once the case was officially closed. For the first time since her death, I wasn't asking for another answer. I was simply asking for one small piece of her to bring home. Over the following months, the investigation expanded far beyond Oregon. Federal authorities uncovered years of fraudulent restoration contracts, money laundering, bribery, and witness intimidation tied to the Rhodes Heritage Foundation. Several executives accepted plea agreements, others testified voluntarily, and museums that had unknowingly been used to disguise financial crimes publicly cleared Elise's name. Newspapers that once described her as a victim of a tragic accident now called her the whistleblower, whose courage exposed one of the largest nonprofit fraud schemes in the region's history. She never lived to hear those words, but the truth finally carried her name instead of suspicion. Avery and Connor slowly found their way back to normal life, though none of us would ever be the same again. Avery returned to treating children with the same quiet patience she'd inherited from her mother. Connor volunteered his engineering skills to restore a historic veterans center, saying he wanted to build something that would outlast all the lies we'd spent months tearing down. For the first time since the funeral, laughter found its way back into family dinners. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically at first, but it stayed. I think Elise would have liked that. She never wanted grief to become the only thing we remembered. Several months later, I drove alone to the overlook above the Cascade Lakes where Elise and I had once dreamed about spending retirement. The cabin we'd almost bought was visible in the distance, tucked between towering pines beside the water. The investigation was over. The trials were finished. There were no more hidden phones, no more encrypted messages, no more unanswered questions waiting inside forgotten boxes. I carried only a small wooden urn containing a handful of wildflower seeds Elise had kept for years, always saying she'd plant them when life finally slowed down. I scattered them across the hillside as the afternoon wind carried them toward the valley below. Before leaving, I reached into my jacket and unfolded the final letter Elise had written to me. I'd read it dozens of times, yet one sentence always stopped me. The greatest gift you ever gave me wasn't believing every word I said. It was giving me a life worth protecting. For months, I'd blamed myself for missing the signs, for not asking harder questions, for believing our life was simpler than it truly was. Standing there above the lake, I finally understood something Elise had known long before I did. Love isn't measured by how many secrets two people never keep. Sometimes it's measured by the sacrifices they quietly make, so the other person never has to carry the same burden. I started this journey believing a hidden phone would reveal my wife's betrayal. Instead, it revealed the greatest act of love I'd never seen. And every time that phone rings in my memory, I no longer hear the beginning of a mystery. I hear the moment Elise made sure the truth would outlive both fear and the people who tried to bury it.